U.S. aging nuclear program.
America's nuclear reactors are getting old. The oldest one opened in 1969, and the average age of all the reactors in the country is nearly 40 years old, and this age is considered too old for sensitive nuclear reactors. Most reactors which operated then are still active today.
It was the first step in a nuclear nightmare. As far as we know at this hour, no worse than that. But a government official said that a breakdown in an atomic power plant in Pennsylvania today is probably the worst nuclear reactor accident to date. There was no apparent serious contamination of workers, but a nuclear safety group said that radiation inside the plant is at 8 times the deadly level, so strong that after passing through a 3-foot thick concrete wall, it can be measured a mile away.
Hello and welcome to We the People, everyone. I'm your host, Daniel Arya, and in this episode, we'll study the aging nuclear plants and nuclear arsenals in the United States. Serious nuclear weapon incident could also be just around the corner, and the Pentagon even has its own phrase for it, broken arrow. There have officially now been 33 nuclear arrows in the history of the United States so far, a number which could be far greater in reality. So what are the risks facing the nuclear sector, and should you be worried? Stay with us.
10 years ago, the Fukushima meltdown triggered a flurry of coverage, raising alarms within the U.S. about the decrepit reactors and how they may function in the face of a dysfunction in the reactors. Most notably, are they safe enough? More than ever before, the nuclear technology seems to be on the verge of slipping out of the U.S. government's control.
The catastrophic aspect of nuclear energy has been there from the get-go. Project Trinity potentially came close to a catastrophe in 1945 in the desert of New Mexico when a lightning storm occurred as a bomb was sitting on top of a tall steel tower. Our first guest today is John LaForge, co-director of Nuke Watch. Welcome to the show, sir.
Oh, my pleasure.
So, John, what are some of the general dangers in having nukes this old, this outdated in America?
Well, they're very similar to the dangers of brand new reactors. They're all confronting living things with the very same dangers. They emit liquid and gaseous radioactivity on a regular basis. They're allowed to do this by permitting. Governments permit nuclear reactors to emit radioactive gases, krypton, xenon, and tritium, daily in order to regulate the temperature, the heat, and the pressure inside these units.
Thank you for joining us, Mr. John LaForge.
After World War II, the U.S. nuclear powers shifted mostly from nuclear warfare to the Cold War and ultimately towards energy production. President Eisenhower championed the cause and attended the opening of the first plant near Shipping Point, Pennsylvania.
Adding radioactive materials to the environment means that it ends up in the air, in the water, in the soil, ultimately in the food chain. Other dangers include, as you mentioned, with old reactors, you have the problem of parts wearing out, equipment being badly or intermittently or inadequately inspected and replaced if need be. And so the failure rate of parts and equipment in reactors increases as they age. The rate of failures goes up.
Many more power plants followed in the 1960s, although most of them were for experimental or training purposes and shut down within a few years' time. A slew of new plants, however, popped up in the late 1960s, as well as the 1970s and 1980s. We're now joined by nuclear scientist Behrad Nakhai to get his perspective on this issue. Thank you for joining us, Doctor.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Now, if you could, please tell us, what are the impacts of outdated nuclear plants on an environment already reeling from the impacts of climate change?
Every problem that you have with nuclear power, or you have had with the nuclear power, was the direct result of human error. If we follow the procedures and we follow what has been dictated to in the operation will go very smoothly. The nuclear power plant is built with many, many, many layers of safety and precaution. And because of that, it is very tolerant. Yet, the nuclear power plants that are operating today in the United States or in majority of the countries in the world are of the older generation, where we were still learning how to build, what to build, and how to operate it.
Thank you, Dr. Nakhei, for joining us on the program.
One of the most concerning aspects of the U.S. nuclear energy is the infrastructure, the wiring and computers in the launch control centers that still rely on 8-inch floppy disks. After all, creating complex technological systems is one thing, and managing them another.
Now, with all the potential dangers that they carry, nuclear power plants supply about 20% of electricity for the U.S. power grid, although almost all of them were built decades back. Looking at the plants today makes one think of a vintage movie set. Do you think old reactors in the United States are doomed to end in failure? What scenarios could you imagine about the fate of those reactors?
Reactor meltdowns caused by earthquakes, tsunamis, other weather events like hurricanes, tornadoes, and quakes that threaten to shut off the cooling of these machines, resulting in overheating, meltdown, and then the broad and disastrous dispersal of highly radioactive materials, cesium-137, iodine-131, strontium-90, and other highly radioactive materials that cause so much cancer and other immune disorders.
Nuclear plants not only produce radioactive waste, but they are also vulnerable to a nuclear meltdown. A simple backup power failure could simply prevent water pumping used to cool the radioactive fuel rods, leading to a disaster. The fuel could heat up rapidly, and since these reactors operate at high pressure, there can be explosion from all this excess heat. The fuel itself is toxic and has to be stored underground for thousands of years. One can only extract about 4% of the energy out of the uranium, and the 96% that is left behind is waste.
The nuclear power plants that are operating today in the United States or in majority of the countries in the world are of the older generation, where we were still learning how to build, what to build, and how to operate it. All these nuclear power plants are maintained, revitalized, changed continuously at every 2 years that they do refueling. So the plant that was built 30 years ago can get a license to run another 30 years.
Many experts and activists believe that Washington urgently needs to transform its regulatory framework, its culture, and its infrastructure related to nuclear operations. According to some estimates, the U.S. will spend about $188 billion over the 2021 to 2030 period to modernize nuclear weapons and delivery systems.
Since we cannot have a destructive testing of the nuclear power plant, we rely quite a bit on the operating experience for different parts of the plant, and IAEA should spearhead that to get into cooperation with the countries to have a safe nuclear power plant rather than try to politicize that.
The U.S. is set to spend some $175 billion toward modernizing its strategic nuclear triad and $13 billion to modernize its tactical nuclear weapons and delivery systems. So where do politicians, both liberals and conservatives, stand when it comes to closing the country's old nuclear power plants?
In the U.S., the pro-nuclear lobby is very, very rich and very powerful. So at the moment, the Congress is considering a bill that would spend $50 billion to prop up and give financial support to old reactors instead of shutting them down. The other thing the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has been doing is increasing the allowed lifespan of nuclear reactors. Every one in the United States was built to last 40 years. The NRC has uniformly and repeatedly given 20-year license extensions to reactor operators, so all over the country.
The US old tech in the nuclear sector means that there is always the possibility for an unexpected accidental launching, firing, detonating, theft, or loss. So far, some 8 US nuclear weapons have been lost and shockingly never recovered.
Inadequate maintenance and inspections. You have cutbacks because of economic problems with the cost of electricity and the reactor operators cutting back on inspections. You have corrosion of particular parts because of the corrosive materials inside these aging units that also weaken and degrade the parts. Ultimately, you have a possibility of loss of offsite power, as happened in Louisiana just recently as a result of a hurricane. Offsite power to the Waterford reactor in Louisiana was cut off, so that meant, and this was after the power went out altogether, that electricity to recirculate the cooling water was halted.
The United States military misplaced at least 8 nuclear weapons permanently during the Cold War. The so-called stray nukes are said to have a combined explosive force 2,200 times the bomb the US dropped on Hiroshima at the end of World War II.
Nuclear power programs in all these countries were initiated in order to provide plutonium for nuclear weapons. It was just a production source of a source of plutonium, because the operating of a nuclear reactor using enriched uranium for fuel produces plutonium. The consequence of bombarding this uranium inside a reactor with neutrons creates plutonium inside the fuel rods. Now, the fuel rods are then removed and replaced with fresh ones after a time, and the used highly radioactive fuel rods can be treated chemically in these giant factories, chemically treated to extract the plutonium for weapons.
The U.S. has nearly 5,000 nuclear warheads with silos in North Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana. Now, this is while the country is short of skillful staff tasked with safeguarding the deadliest objects ever known to man. Dangerous mix of aging nuclear plants, industry cost-cutting, and reduced safety oversight could come at a great cost not only for Americans, but for all of humanity.
The problems with the environment have to do with the people and the animals that live nearby. Many times, studies have repeatedly shown that the effects of these emissions on populations near reactors is an increase in cancer and leukemia, especially in young people.
The U.S. government needs to immediately address deficiencies in its oversight of nuclear reactor safety. At a June 2019 meeting, Nuclear Regulatory Commissioner Jeff Barron elicited from the staff that the number of sudden reactor shutdowns saw a nearly 20% increase and rose from 39 in 2017 to 46 in 2018.
Problems with older reactors, as I mentioned, tend to increase as they age. And so the impact on the environment is manyfold. It involves as I mentioned, the emission of radioactive gases and liquids, the problems of maintenance and upkeep, and the environment around these nuclear reactors ends up to be more heavily contaminated with radioactive materials than areas that don't have active or operating reactors in them.
The US has too many nuclear weapons and facilities but appears incapable of taking care of them properly. The US narrowly avoided a catastrophic disaster when 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs were accidentally dropped over Goldsboro, North Carolina on January 23, 1961.
Politicians are indebted to the nuclear lobby, which Professor Judith Pasternak showed spends hundreds of millions of dollars every year. Her study was published in 2010. With her students, she found that the companies that run reactors and the unions that support the workers in these plants spent $600 million lobbying between 2008 and 2000, just in 2 years, from 2008 and 2009, they spent that much money.
In the 1961 incident, a Boeing B-52 Stratofortress carrying 2 3 to 4 megaton Mark 39 nuclear bombs broke up in midair, dropping its nuclear payload in the process near Goldsboro, North Carolina. Bombs miraculously failed to explode, but there are still those who defend the nuclear sector as a source of clean energy, arguing that more nuclear plants should be built in America.
Eventually, the hope is that the United States, because of the pollution and because of the climate changes, will come around and build new reactors. The mentality toward nuclear power in the United States has been changing quite a bit during the recent years. And now, whether you are the left or the right, conservative or liberal, more and more are realizing that a main response to the problem and challenges of climate is the nuclear power plant. And it's more and more coming back in the fold, and the people's attitude toward nuclear power plant are changing as well, and more are accepting.
The US nuclear power industry is facing major challenges. The nuclear reactor fleet is getting older as the sector faces other cheaper and safer sources of energy from the sun, the wind, as well as gas. More intensive monitoring and preventive maintenance are therefore required for them to operate safely.
The way the industry calls it safe and reliable and carbon-free, all these things are preposterously wrong, and they're demonstrably provable wrong. We know from disasters at 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima that none of these reactors are safe because of power outages, sea level rise, sea level surges during horrific storms, that these reactors aren't reliable. And of course, the mining and milling of uranium, the production of fuel, the building of reactors that involves hundreds of millions of tons of cement can't be considered carbon-free for a minute.
After all, aging-related failures could result in catastrophes that even US adversaries such as Russia and China would not want. What is the relation between the US nuclear sector and its rivalry with other superpowers such as Russia?
In the nuclear power plant technology, there is no rivalry based on technology. The rivalry only comes based on each country's financial interest. There are around 440 nuclear power plants operating around the world. About 93 of those are operating in the United States, about 56 in France, about 50 in China, about 38 in Russia, and about 33 in Japan, and goes down the list. It really amounts to, number one, technical capability of designing, building, and operating of the nuclear power plant. And two, whether financial part of it justifies. Russia has a lot of capability to build more, but because of the oil and gas that they have, they only build nuclear power plants when they need it.
Since old times, U.S. nuclear plants have been playing an important role in U.S. energy production, but they remain old, dangerous, and unsafe. There is not enough supervision on these plants, and many U.S. activists believe they're like ticking time bombs, particularly with little inspection from nuclear watchdogs such as the International Atomic Energy Agency.
Inability to convey the information about the safety of the new nuclear power plant. Other countries are far ahead of the United States. For example, China is ahead. France is thinking about the new reactors. United Kingdom is studying for the new reactors, and many other countries are actively studying and building new reactors.
Some of the plants in the U.S. are currently working beyond the license granted to them by the U.S. government itself. Who are the victims suffering from repercussions of old nuclear plants, and what role should nuclear watchdogs, such as the IAEA, play?
None of the older reactors, whether United States or any other country, cause any danger. If the management follow the rules, follow the procedures for the operating of those plants. IAEA has two very important roles that often due to bending up due to political wills does not perform action. Number one is to provide help to every country around the world that wants to use peaceful nuclear power plant. IAEA is not doing that effectively now. It should get more into that. Number two, it should provide a very bank of information about the operation of nuclear power plants around the world.
The U.S. ability to protect their facilities from terrorist attacks are also on decline, which could potentially expose them to rogue element, raising prospects of fuel meltdowns and releases of radiation to the environment. Only in the year 2018, more than 100 security violations were officially reported, a figure that sounds alarming to the public.
We also need to educate the lawmakers, parliamentarians, the politicians, and other government officials about these hazards. We need to work locally with city and municipal council members, especially in areas where they have operating nuclear reactors or nuclear facilities like a reprocessing plant, for example, or a fuel fabrication site, or potential uranium mining. We need to connect with other movements as well, like campaigns against gun violence, climate change, campaigns for racial justice and indigenous people's rights, diversity in political life. All these groups or campaigns are relevant to challenging the status quo here. We need to disrupt also the dominant narrative about nuclear power.
Now, many experts highlight the increasingly significant necessity for an appropriate level of oversight, not just by American, but by international organizations such as the IAEA. Well, that was our show, everyone. Thank you for watching. I'm your host, Daniel Arya, and do stay tuned next week when we come back with another episode of We the People. Bye-bye for now.